Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's CCI Golden Horseshoe Chapter Condo Talk webinar. My name is Nancy Houle, and I'm a partner at a law firm DHA, which is a law firm servicing the Eastern Ontario region. And I'm also the president of my local CCI chapter, CCI Eastern Ontario. I am delighted and honored to have been asked today to participate as moderator in place of Maria Durham of Simpson Wiggle Law. She is your usual fabulous moderator, but unfortunately is not available today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and channel my inner Maria today, do the best possible job I can, and to facilitate your session today, but not to worry, she'll be back, I believe, for the next one. Condo Talk was created to provide free, short, informative, and practical solution-based webinars to condo owners, directors, managers, and those servicing the condominium industry. Before we move into the substantive components of today's session, I'd just like to take a few moments to acknowledge the sponsors of today's Condo Talk, as these sponsors are incredibly important to allowing GHC to provide educational webinars for these events at no cost. So a great big thank you to SV Law and to Elliott Associates, both condominium lawyers. So that leads me right into our fantastic speakers for today. We have two excellent speakers joining us, offering legal and management perspectives on minutes. The first is actually a partner at our sponsor today from Elia Associates, Richard Elia, a condo lawyer specializing with full ranges of legal services to condos throughout Ontario. A friend of mine, and also I have the pleasure throughout my legal career of working with Richard as opposing counsel and also as members on board of directors at CCI Eastern Ontario. Richard is incredibly involved with CCI, is constantly sought out as a speaker and an educator throughout the province, probably because he's always looking at issues and topics from an objective, effective, and ethical approach. Yeah, we know he's a lawyer, but we can still all be ethical and practical and effective, right? So we're delighted, Richard. He also takes part in rebuilding cars on a regular basis. So that might be something that he might talk about at the next topic. Stay tuned. Just a little bit of a highlight there. And of course, we also have fantastic Michelle Joy with us here today. She is a general license manager and registered condo manager and a director of condo management at Wilson Blanchard. She is also a member of the finance and conference committees of the Golden Horseshoe chapter and has become the frequent flyer at your Condo Talk sessions. I understand she is in great demand for her sessions and talks these days. So welcome, Michelle. I'm delighted to be participating with both of you here today. So what is our topic today? Today's Condo Talk deals with an issue that is not necessarily always at the forefront of our minds, but is very often one of the hottest topics for disputes and liability: minutes. You gotta love them or you gotta hate them, depending on which side of the fence you're on there. So before we launch into just a little bit of more of an intro on minutes, I think we'll start off with a poll, just to get a sense of what our attendees are doing with respect to minutes. You're going to see in front of you a poll with 4 questions. As we do our little intro here, we'll get you to go ahead and answer some of those questions. The first question is, who does your minutes? The next, do you keep separate in-camera minutes? The next, how involved is your property manager with meeting discussion? And finally, are your condo corporation minutes full transcripts, bare bones, somewhere in between, or you're not sure? So go ahead and take a few moments to answer that as we jump into just a short introduction of our minutes session here today. Whether it be taking minutes, producing minutes, arranging a minute taker, or deciding which meetings need minutes, there are a myriad of decisions which have to be made by your board of director and managers on practically a day-to-day basis, which all relate to minutes. And so often, we don't really realize the traps and pitfalls that can arise solely from the corporate minutes, perhaps until we're right into them. The corporation's minutes are incredibly important documents. These documents tell the story of the corporation. But I won't steal Richard's thunder. He's going to tell us all about what minutes are, why they're important, and then throughout today's sessions, what some of the key issues we need to focus on are today. For the purpose of today's session, we've broken down our topics temporally. We're first going to deal with issues you need to consider before the meeting, then issues you need to consider during the meeting, and finally post-meeting, both from a legal and a practical perspective. Looks like most of our poll poll topics have been answered by now, so I think we're good to go ahead and share those results. There we are. There's some interesting results that we're getting on each of our questions. Who does your minutes? The majority, property manager, 47%, followed closely by a board member. Do you keep separate in-camera minutes? Close there, 50% no, 42% yes. How involved in the property manager with meeting discussion? Very involved, vast majority. And are your condo corporation minutes, what best describes them? 72%, somewhere in between. Fantastic. Well, I think this is going to be very important information for our speakers today. As we go through each of our sessions, I'm sure they'll be referring back to some of that information. So we're going to start right off, jumping right in with Richard. Before the meeting, Richard, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Nancy. In case I forget to go back to that poll, I love those results. So they worry me. And so if I forget, please bring them back up at the right time. It's hard to talk about minutes without starting with the Latin derivative. It seems that everyone always starts with that, but we also have to look at the function of the board. On the Latin side, Google it, and you'll get the background. The words minutiae or minuta scriptura will come up, meaning trifles, details, small notes. So effectively, meeting minutes are a condensation or a condensing of the minutes of the meeting, what happened, the most important points. They're also, from a legal standpoint, prima facie evidence of what's going on, the resolutions and the proceedings. It's confirmation that the meeting was held on a given date, confirmation of who was actually present at that meeting, and not the least of which, confirmation of the decisions and the business that was carried out. And because if they're done properly, they are prima facie evidence, they're given a high degree of deference. So if somebody wants to challenge minutes, the burden of proof is on that side, not your condo, ideally. I'll tell you what the courts have recognized that minutes are not. They're not speeches, they're not arguments, they're not motions, they're not a report of everything that might come up at a board meeting. And just to add a bit of ridiculousness to this, I'm sure with the holidays just passed, you probably talked about what you did on your holidays, what you cooked for Christmas dinner, etc. You don't want any of that in it, even if the meeting's being called to order. All right. What it is a minute is a record of what was done or agreed upon. And we often hear, and came up in the in the poll, the terms like bare bones or verbatim. Bare bones is just the motion, really. At least that's how I see it. Move to hire Michelle as your manager. Passed, but it doesn't tell us why. Why would you want to hire Michelle as your manager? And that's sort of where we're going. Verbatim is the opposite, where we have the Christmas menu. Everything goes in it, and I'm sorry if anyone's ever read verbatim minutes, they're really hard to follow. There's so much filler, for lack of a better word, or garbage in them. It really doesn't help. So where do we look for some guidance? We could look at, let's start with the Act. And there's not a whole lot in the Act, but if we look at Section 55, Section 55 deals with records of the condo. And we know that minutes are a record. Both unit owner meetings and board meetings are records of the condo. And by the way, we're focusing on board meetings for the purpose of today. The meeting minutes are a record. And what 55 sub 1 says is the corporation shall keep adequate records. So now we have to think about what is adequate. I'm going to get back to a case or two that deals with that in a bit. But as I was prepping, I came across one definition that I really, really like. It might be a bit controversial, which is minutes are a self-serving record of discussions and decisions on material issues, and self-serving for the board. Why do I say that might be controversial? Because, well, there's boards, there's owners, there's everybody else. Why am I only choosing one side? Well, because we have to look at how condos operate and what the role of the board is in that. So we start with Section 27, which is the board is elected to manage your condo. The board's your elected government. They're actually to manage the affairs of the condo. So then we have to ask, well, what are the affairs of the condo? And this takes us back to section 17, where we've got the objects and duties of the condominium. The objects are to manage the property. There's a duty to control, manage, and administer the common elements. There's a duty to effect compliance. All of this is on the condo, which is managed by the board. And the owners have the right under section 119 to expect this. They have the right to expect it. So then we come back to standard of care, which I'm sure has crossed your minds from time to time. The director's standard of care. Every director shall act honestly in good faith to that standard and care of the reasonable condo director, reasonable purpose or person in comparable circumstances. Where am I going with all this? Well, you're making decisions. And there's something called the business judgment rule, which says if board members are acting reasonably in good faith, they should expect that the court will not second guess their decisions. The courts recognize that as board members, you're in the best position to make the best decisions for your community. So what we want to see in the minutes is that there was adequate consideration given to the decision-making process, a degree of prudence and diligence. It's not a standard of perfection, but looking back in hindsight, can a reasonable person, can a court, if necessary, find that there was that reasonable prudence in arriving at that decision. So before a meeting, what I want to leave you with before a meeting is insist on the detail. When you're handed an agenda, do you know what you're going, well, are you handed an agenda, I guess would be the first question. You must have an agenda. You need to know what you're going to be discussing, what you're going to be voting on. If you're discussing issues about management, that's one thing. If all of a sudden there's a motion to hire a new property management company that came out of the blue, that's completely different. All right, what was the basis of that decision? What other companies were reviewed? What criteria was considered, etc. All right, so when you arrive at a board meeting, you've got to have the materials necessary to actively participate, to be adequately prepared for that meeting. And it's your responsibility as directors to make sure you have that. If you don't have it, ask for it. And if necessary, ask for the meeting or the decision to be delayed if necessary. Because again, going back, that the business judgment rule, when somebody second guesses what was done 2, 3, 4, 10 years later, you want to make sure that what is in the minutes shows that you've taken that degree of prudence and diligence in making that decision. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So when we're discussing pre-meeting, I'm going to talk about the practical application as a property manager and working with boards, how I prepare in advance for a board meeting to take the proper minutes. So Richard kind of touched on some of what I'm going to elaborate on a little bit further, but I think before you even get to the meeting, the first question you have to ask yourself is who takes the minutes? Who's taking the minutes? Because in order to adequately prepare, you need to know if you're going to be the minute taker or you're just going to be a participant in the meeting. So I think a starting point would certainly be reviewing the corporation's bylaws. There may be some guidance in there about the role of the secretary of the board that may indicate who should be taking the minutes at the meeting. Just like the chair of the meeting, which we'll further elaborate on, just because the bylaws may delegate the secretary to be the minute taker. They do, they have the option to delegate that role to someone else. Based on our poll results, I think it was the majority respondents said that property manager takes their minutes, which in my experience is very common, which is fine. But I think you need to, as a board, if that is the expectation that your manager is going to be taking the minutes, ensure that your management agreement covers that service. Is that included service in your management agreement, or is it offered at an additional cost? So that's something that you as a board need to be aware of, either when entering into your management agreement initially, if that's a service that you're looking for, or in advance of your meetings, have that discussion with your property manager or management firm and find out if that is what a service that they will be providing for you. So overall, there are 3 options that I have seen for a minute taker, and they were again included in our poll. Typically, it's a board member or the board secretary, the property manager, or a third-party minute-taking company. and again, in my experience, it's often the property manager. So pre-meeting, how do you prepare for the role as minute taker for that meeting? So like Richard said, there should be a clear agenda set for that meeting. Once a clear agenda has been established, it'll really help with the flow of the meeting. And not only the flow of the meeting, but it'll help the minute taker accurately take the minutes, because they can guide through the agenda. They'll know what the board is talking about, what the next discussion topic will be. It'll be much smoother for them to accurately take the minutes if the board is following along with a clear established agenda. Review the documents in advance. So, skim the agenda in advance, know what's going to be talked about. Typically, there's also some sort of meeting or management report provided in advance with the agenda. As the minute taker, it's also beneficial to read that in advance, so that when the board gets to a topic, you have an understanding of what they're discussing, so that when you go to take the minutes, it's not entirely new information. Now, of course, if there's a new business item, you may not be familiar with that, but at least by reading the agenda and the manager's report and any associated documents, such as a bid summary or a quote or a legal opinion, you're going to have a better understanding of what they're talking about and make it easier for you to take those minutes at the meeting. A template can be really helpful. So part of the presentation we're doing today is going to include a template. Once we've completed this presentation, a template will be circulated for the participants. And this is something that you can use as a guide for taking minutes in the future. But having a template to work off of, or a script, is a lot easier. So for example, you can look at the agenda items. If there's approval of minutes, approval of proposals, you can go to that template and fill in the board reviewed the minutes of the meeting of January 12th, 2021 on a motion by blank, second by blank, with all in favor. And then when you go to the actual meeting, you can just type in the names of who's making those decisions. So that can help you be more efficient in taking the minutes at the meeting. That is, I was going to make a note about owners lists. So owners lists aren't required for board meeting minutes. We're not really touching on owners meetings at this time, but that would be something you would take to an owners meeting, because you often need to reference name and unit number, and it's handy to have for a quick reference in an owners meeting. But today's focus is mostly on board meetings. And that's it for my practical application of pre-meeting prep.
Great, Michelle. Thank you. So Michelle and Richard, we do have a couple of questions that came in during that pre-session. So I think we may as well try and tackle a couple of those before we move on to the next topic. The first one is twofold. And I think, Richard, you answered the second part of it. So we'll do that first. The second part of that question is, what constitutes what is and is not necessary to put into the minutes? And for the most part, I think you gave us a good general summary. Did you have maybe in, I don't know, a minute or less, a bit of a guidance, key words that you can give?
I'm going to get to the adequacy towards the end.
Fantastic. So when you get to adequacy, then maybe you can also talk about the possible legal ramifications of a property manager previously, or a board member or a minute taker previously not having kept accurate records.
I do deal with that, but I'll touch on it now.
Sure.
I'm sucking and blowing here. The bottom line is, in a condo, the board's the elected government, so it doesn't matter who's taking your minutes. The board is the body that approves the minutes. So you've got to take that very seriously and make sure they are accurate at the time they're approved. It's not. It's got not. It doesn't matter who's taking them. The responsibility is that of the board.
Terrific. So, and I know you'll touch on it again later on, so I'm just going to mark that one as answered for now. Do the tenders for a project have to be included in the minutes? Michelle, from a practical perspective.
Typically, I don't include the full copy of the tender in the minutes. Kind of piggybacking on a comment Richard made, I think what I typically do, and I'll get to this, I'm going to elaborate further, is I think you should have a brief description that you reviewed 3 or 5 or however many tenders, and maybe highlight who those contractors are before you have the motion or the decision on who it's awarded to. But I don't think you need a full copy of it included in the minutes, no.
Okay, and one more question for the pre-meeting, and then we'll get on to our next session with more questions to come later. Should owners be provided with a copy of the agenda before a board meeting? It looks like there's some concern that some owners and some corporations may not know when the board meetings are being held. So just from your perspective, do owners typically get a copy of the agenda before a board meeting?
From a management perspective, no, that's typically only circulated to the board. And I will comment that just in working with boards, some do let their owners know when the next meeting will be held. And I think that there's a benefit to that, because if an owner has a request or a concern they want to note, they have a deadline in which they should submit that to know when the next board meeting is, or they know when to expect a response from the board if they need to discuss it at a meeting. But that's not, I wouldn't say that that's a requirement. I think it could be good practice.
Great, Richard?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. It's a board function, so there's no legal requirement. Later on, we'll talk about posting minutes and whatnot, making those available, which I think is a bit different when it comes to transparency. Yeah.
Great. So why don't we jump in then to the second portion of our talk today, during the meeting. And I think we're going to start with Michelle this time. From a practical perspective and from the manager's perspective, what do we need to think about during the meeting? Over to you, Michelle.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to go through a couple different aspects, and I think, I mean, I've worked with a number of corporations over the years, and I would say 90% of the time I act as the minute taker. And I will note that I think it definitely depends on the region that you're working in. I work in the Golden Horseshoe area, so Hamilton, Burlington, Halton, a little bit into Niagara, that general area. We deal with a lot of much smaller corporations, in the 20 to 100 unit range. And so I think that's if you're from, let's say, the Toronto area, and where you're working with a lot of large high rises that have, 400 to 600 units, I think the manager's role at a meeting is going to be a little bit different. So just kind of a preamble that my perspective is coming from kind of the region and the demographic in which I work in. So role of the minute taker. So the minute taker should not be participating in the discussion of the meeting. The role of the minute taker is to listen, take notes, and produce the minutes. If they have questions, if the minute taker has a question about if they need something repeated or they just need something clarified when they are taking notes, obviously they are allowed to speak and inquire. Questions should be directed to the chair for clarification. But otherwise, the role of the minute taker is to sit in the meeting, listen, take notes, and then produce the minutes at the end of it. However, this can obviously become complicated if a board member or a manager is also playing the role of minute taker. Because their discussion is typically required as part of participation in the meeting. So it can become difficult when the minute taker is not a third-party independent individual and is a board member or manager. And I'm going to elaborate that on a little bit more. But ultimately, the minute taker should note as much information as possible during the meeting. However, not all of that information needs to be included in the minutes. So as Richard said, we don't want verbatim minutes. You need to be able to decipher what is the critical information that needs to be noted as part of the official record of the meeting. And I think I work with a lot of new managers, and in preparing for this session, I was saying that it's very hard to teach someone to specifically know what to pull out of a meeting. So when someone's new, we usually say, try and write down as much as possible, and create a set of minutes that you think accurately reflects the record. I would rather go through and tell you to delete 5 sentences than you come back to me with 1 sentence on a very important legal discussion. So if you're new to minute taking, I always say take a little more notes, and then we can cut back on it. So that's kind of the role of the minute taker from my perspective. I want to touch on a little bit as a manager or a board member, as both chairperson and minute taker, because again, this is something I experience often with the corporations that I work with. And from the polls that we had, it seems to be common with our participants in this session today as well. So it's going to vary from corporation to corporation. Each board is going to operate differently, and different management firms are going to operate differently. I think often many bylaws will state that the president is to act as chair for the meeting, but often I see that the president, a lot of board members just don't feel comfortable acting as chair or running a meeting, so they often delegate that role to the property manager. So the manager or the board member could be acting as the chairperson and also the minute taker. So what kind of challenges does that pose, and how do we address that during the meeting? So it can be a difficult task as the chair to run the meeting and both take accurate minutes and then also participate in the discussion. You're wearing kind of, as a manager or board member, you're taking on 3 roles: minute taker, chair, and then also assisting your corporation in discussion and decision making. While the manager should not be included in any decision making processes, often they are included in the discussion. So as the manager, you're going to be saying, you might be giving a summary of the tenders you've received for the board. You might be giving them a summary of a discussion you had with a homeowner or a contractor, just so they have a better understanding of what it is they're about to make a decision on. What I will say is that a well-prepared management report in advance of the meeting can help eliminate the amount of discussion needed. So if, as a manager, you put together a very detailed management report, you've got 3 bid summaries, you put a very detailed bid summary in your management report, and the board reads that in advance of the meeting and comes to the meeting prepared, that can cut down on the discussion and make the manager's role as chair and minute taker a little bit easier because they don't have to participate in the discussion as much. In this scenario where the board or manager may be acting as multiple roles in the meeting, there may be moments where the conversation needs to pause, or your manager or board member may need to ask you to repeat or clarify a section of the meeting just because they're trying to listen and give their professional advice, but also trying to take accurate minutes. So I know I talk, when I'm training new managers, I say, don't be afraid to ask your board to just pause for a minute to make sure that you can accurately take the minutes that you need to take. Don't rush through it and not get the information that you need. The board should also be aware that if the manager is diligently taking the proper notes and minutes, they may not be 100% focused on the discussion. So I know there's times where I'm typing in what the discussion was, and I need to ask my board to repeat a question that they asked to me because I'm focused on taking the notes and not fully listening. So it certainly can pose a challenge when a board member or a manager is playing multiple roles in the meeting. Like I said earlier, my experience is based on the area in which I work in. For smaller corporations, let's say 20 to 100 units, the average cost for a minute taker, I apologize, my dog is barking. The average cost for, sorry, it's a delivery. The average cost for a minute taker is, I'm going to say easily $200 to $300 per meeting. For a 30-unit townhouse site, they simply can't afford $200 to $300 a month for their meetings. They don't have a large budget like a 400-unit high-rise would. So in the area that we work in, it is very common that the board member or the manager fills that role. And while it may not always be the most efficient in terms of function of the meeting, in my experience, it generally goes over well. In larger high-rise condominiums that I've worked with, typically they do hire a third-party minute-taking company. And I will say that it does help the flow a little bit when the board and the manager can fully participate in the discussion and don't have to worry about taking accurate notes. So that's my management perspective on the process of during the meeting.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Now, Richard, I'm not sure if you've been able to follow some of the Q&A that we have on the board as well. I see you're going to be touching on a number of these subjects, I think, during your during the meeting. So I'm not going to read all of them. I'll try and remember if we don't touch on them at the end. But did you have a chance to look at some of them?
I've been sort of scrolling through, but catch me at the end and we'll go through.
Okay, terrific.
And first off, I got an email from my mother saying I'm not supposed to use a certain term when I'm giving these presentations, so I apologize to her. Just to pick up on what Michelle was saying about who is the minute taker, I can't let this one go. We did discuss this beforehand because I see the reality that Michelle works in as being more economically driven. But to me, the minute taker should not be an active participant at meetings. Michelle mentioned this. And I think it's bang on. I just have difficulty seeing how the two roles can be separated. If it's a very smooth running meeting or smooth running condo, a lot goes by the wayside. But conflict happens in every condo. And the reality is, management to me is your bureaucracy. They're preparing the management, the report that you're reading beforehand. They're guiding, perhaps, guiding you through that report, taking part in discussion on the report, and then receiving their instructions on what to do going out of the meeting. Very active participant. So, and I understand the economics. No question. It's just something I've always had an issue with. Then when we get into directors doing it, the fact that somebody is the secretary of the board does not mean they have to be the recording secretary. Or bring in a community member or somebody's teenage son or daughter. There's a degree of skill that goes into keeping minutes. Very important. There's the need to participate in the discussion if you're a director. That's what you were elected for. And lastly, if you've got a volunteer doing minutes, really hard to fire that person. If they're messing up, it's going to create other, egos are going to get in the way. That it's just going to become difficult. Jumping to recordings of board meetings, because this happens, and why not? As long as the recordings are a tool in taking and formulating the minutes. The recordings are not an asset of the condo. You don't want them to be an asset of the condo. You want them actually, frankly, to be destroyed after the minutes are approved, because the minutes are your record. Remember, self-serving record that we talked about earlier. It's not verbatim. The recording is verbatim. That's not where we're going. Going on to the reality that sometimes you have a single director keeping or taking a recording. Shouldn't happen. All right, everybody's got the right to speak freely at these meetings. So if there's going to be a recording, it's got to be approved by the board. That's the minute taker taking the recording. And at the end of the day, again, the board speaks with one voice. So again, going back to best practices, meetings are brief, plus the basis for the decision. Attached to the minutes what you're relying on for them. Be careful what you reference in the minutes. I'm sure if we did a poll right now and asked how many boards conduct business by email, a number of yeses will happen. Doesn't matter how many times we've said at sessions like this, you can't do board meeting business by email. If you do, because we understand it's the reality, ratify the decision at the next meeting. But if you ratify the decision and make reference to the email discussions that happened as your justification, guess what? Those emails are finding their way into the minutes. And you may or may not want that. Then we got to think about confidentiality that comes up during board meeting minutes. In the poll, there was, do you keep in-camera minutes or do you not? Well, access to records is, since the act changed and the CAT came out, access to records is huge. And anybody not keeping in-camera minutes is just really making work for somebody that's got to redact minutes. And why are you redacting? Confidentiality. Anything, if you look at section 55 sub 4 of the act, unit owners do not have the right to see records relating to employees, records relating to actual or contemplated litigation or insurance investigations, matters relating to specific units or owners, unless of course it is that unit or your unit owner. So for example, we got a question the other day, somebody wanted a list of all the units that still had outstanding balcony repairs. Not getting it. You'll get a list you'll get the number of how many are left, but you're not getting which units those balconies are attached to. That's specific. So for stuff like that, anything where you're dealing with that confidentiality issue, it's much easier to just go in camera and you're basically just keeping 2 sets of minutes. But if you do, give a reason as to why you're going in camera, because otherwise somebody will take you to the CAT, and the CAT's already said you might end up redacting your in-camera minutes if necessary, just to show that they were properly in camera. It happens. So you're at a meeting and the board's going down one road and you just don't agree with it as the sole director. What do? Well, you object. You might vote against a certain motion. They're still doing it, and your position is, we're attracting liability, not to just the condo, but I'm worried about personal liability here. You cover your backside. How do you cover your backside? First, you ask that your objection is noted in the minutes. All right, you ask. You just say, I want my objection noted. I want my name there noted in the minutes. Then when the draft minutes come out to review, it's your job to make sure your name is there, right? Because that falls back to the board. So then you've got this case that comes up, shouldn't, but it does, where the majority outvotes the minority about what objections go in the minutes. Shouldn't happen. So what you're left with is creating that written record. All of a sudden, as a board member, you've got no choice but to just start putting the condo on notice of your objection, create that written record. For those board members out there that just like to abstain on difficult decisions, I don't know why this happens, but it does happen. Typically the same individuals just abstain. It's not going to protect you. Generally, if you abstain on something, you're deemed to have voted with the majority. So if you want to protect yourself from personal liability, make sure your objection is there. Board member notes. This is another way to protect yourself. And it's got pros and cons. I think the reality is many aspects of running a condo are not solved over one meeting. You can't just read a report, make a decision, and send Michelle on her way. Some things go on. There's the larger construction projects. There's litigation that just has a life of its own and carries on and on. And as individual directors, you might actually just keep a file of, it could be opinions, reports, notes, etc., just to keep you in the, keep your own mind going in the direction that you want. It can be very helpful, but at the end of the day, there's some conflict there because, again, the condo is supposed to speak with one voice. If you've got a smooth running issue, I love the idea of getting rid of notes and having a policy on that. But I'm not going to stop any director that wants to protect themselves from keeping their notes. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so I was just going through and I was noting to all where you'd already answered some of the questions in the Q&A that you were answering it as you went along, but just a couple, I think, of general questions that really do apply to this section. Just if we kind of dig in a little bit more, if you record the meeting, so for example, we're all doing virtual meetings right now, right? If we record that meeting through a virtual meeting, should we be destroying it afterwards? And I think, Richard, you had said once the minutes are done, yes. Yep. And I think that's the best practice in the industry.
Yeah, I've gotten in the practice of actually announcing at the beginning of meetings that it is being recorded, or I'll get the organizer to announce it is being recorded. However, it's being recorded as a tool in taking the minutes. Exactly. And that's it. And that's where it should stop. It's not a record of the condo. It should not belong to the condo. Whoever's recording it should not deliver it to the condo. Keep it with the minute taker.
Right. And then that leads right into, what if you record the meeting and afterwards someone at the management company or another third party creates the minutes based on that recording? Is that okay? So they weren't there live, but they're doing it based on the virtual recording of the meeting. How do we feel about that?
I think it's possible, and I'm going to defer to Michelle, who's got more practical knowledge than I do on this, but I think it's where we're going. Again, it could be a cost savings tool, and ideally in doing it. But the bottom line is, no matter how it's created, it comes back. It's going to be the board that approves. It's got to verify, certify, and approve those minutes.
Michelle, anything else?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Richard is saying. So I agree with it.
Okay, so just two more, I think, that I want to touch on for here, and then we'll leave the rest to the end, perhaps. Should you use owner names or unit numbers in boards or AGM meetings? And I guess each of you will have a unique perspective on that, because some of it is required for decision making and to reference back, but then you may or may not be redacting those at a later date. So Michelle, over to you first.
Yeah, so when it comes to board meetings, my practice typically tends to be, I will typically refer, if a discussion is taking place, I typically don't reference specifically board names. So I will say the board, reviewed something or the board discussed something. Obviously, when it comes to recorded votes or decision making, I'm going to specifically note that Richard made a motion, Nancy seconded it, or Nancy voted in favor, Richard voted against. So I typically generalize the board unless it comes to specific decision making or voting, or like if an objection is being made. Unit owners' names in board meetings, very rarely. I typically just refer to the specific unit number. Unit 101 is violating the rules. This is how we're going to tackle it. When it comes to AGM minutes, which I know we're not specifically focusing on, but it was asked. Typically, we try and put at least Mr. or Mrs. last name and unit number. So I like in AGM minutes, I like name and unit number referred to, but in board meeting minutes, just the unit number is typically what I do. Richard, for comment.
I'll go backwards. Board, owners meeting, since it was brought up, I just find there's way too much detail kept in most AGM minutes. Who said what really isn't a matter for minutes. And the crazy thing is when you get to the next meeting, invariably someone stands up and says, "This is so and so from unit 102." It says, "I'm from unit 103. Can you change it?" There's no business being transacted. It's a comment that's being made. It's great to know because the board can then follow up, but not necessary. When we get to board minutes, if you're dealing with an owner violating the rules, in camera. If you're dealing with considering a legal opinion on something, we rate all our opinions as being privileged and confidential to the board. We anticipate the possibility of litigation. So it's up to the board to waive that if they ever want to waive it. But we're not producing a document to be circulated. All right, so that opinion should be, you can reference it, but privileged and confidential does not get attached. I noticed there was one question came up about the tenders again.
I was going to get to that after. You just answered the legal question or the legal opinion one, so that's great. So I can reread the tender question. So the question or the comment was, there was a bit of surprise as to the fact that the tenders would not be included. And I think that maybe there was a bit of a misunderstanding. So it says, I'm a bit surprised that the tender review should not include the factors that influenced a certain decision or choice. What would happen if one of the contractors was not chosen to litigate the selection process? And it's a really tricky and careful issue. So Richard, did you want to talk a little bit more on that?
Well, I think it goes down one path of tendering, and it depends which path you take in the tendering process. I think whenever you go out for, I don't want to go into the law of tendering. That could be another condo talk. But what I think you need to have in the minutes is the logic to choose the one company. So it might be a summary. You want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples if you're considering 3 different management companies that you want to hire, apples to apples, and that might be the summary. And that's what you would do. You don't need all of the rest necessarily, but there's got to be enough to know to justify your decision in hindsight.
Okay, so there's so many fun questions and so much fun dialogue. I'll push us along though, just to get to our third section, and then we'll see how much time we have for questions at the end. So we're now looking at after the meeting. So we've got our minutes prepared. What are the key issues that might come up afterwards? We'll start with you, Richard, then over to you, Michelle.
Okay, I purposely deferred dealing with adequate till after, because this is when the minutes get reviewed and approved, as opposed to when they're taken, or if you're working from a recording. So section 55(1), as I said, says the corporation shall keep adequate records, and there we got a CAT case that says the CAT's got authority to determine if something is adequate now. So what does the word adequate mean? And I'm amazed that we keep going back to this old case, McKay and Waterloo North 23. It's a 1992 decision. When I started practicing law, this was the only case out there, and nobody looked at it, because nobody ever considered records and meetings and whatnot. It was one of these obscure little cases, and it's now getting a voice because it deals with adequacy. And what the case does, and again, go back to what I was saying at the very beginning of this session, where I talk about the role of the board, the role of the condo, what owners have the right to. So the objects and duties of the condo to control, manage, and administer the property. Owners have the right to that performance, and the records have to be adequate to show that the condo is fulfilling those duties and obligations. All right, that's what the case says. And then we have a recent CAT case that goes into a bit more detail. So the standard is not perfection. Inaccuracy can be tolerated, but because board meeting minutes are so important and so fundamental to show how the condo is controlled, managed, and administered, it's a high standard here. It's likely different for other meetings. And this responsibility, as I've said a couple of times now, rests with the board. Doesn't matter if you're using a professional minute taker or if it's little Joey down the hall. It's up to the board to make sure that those minutes are proper. And if the minutes don't flow, if there's obvious errors in the minutes, well, we now have a CAT case that can order you to correct those minutes. Now, when I first read this, I was thinking, what? How can they do that? There is an earlier condo case or CAT case that says they wouldn't, but it's a little bit different. In this one, they're basically saying, correct it and show it as a correction. It just did not, the facts of this case did not flow. So show the correction. You're not going back and messing with the earlier minutes. You're actually showing the correction. Very important. Altering minutes. Again, this flows off that CAT case. Mistakes happen when they're found. They should be corrected, but show the correction, identify the correction. If altering minutes means that what's being written up does not mesh with what was talked about, then there's a different problem. And if you're in the minority there, protect yourself. Go back to that cover your backside ideas, which were discussed earlier. Keep notes, voice your objection, put the condo notice, etc. Because you don't want to be drawn into that, and you might need to make some more hay out of that. Approval of minutes. Again, this lies with the board. You've got to critically and carefully review the drafts. All right, don't just walk in and say, I vote okay, or spell my name right and I'll vote okay. Not enough. You've got to make sure that what's in those minutes reflects the business that took place. And again, think down the road. If condos are very political, so we always want to think down the road. If you're a director today, you might be tossed tomorrow, and somebody might be gunning for you tomorrow. So you want to make sure that those minutes, if they're second guessed in hindsight, will stand up. One voice, duty of confidentiality. This should go without saying. The board does speak with one voice. So what do we do about the director that runs out and speaks with a different voice? Well, we have this lovely case. Nancy's firm was involved in it, Bellingham and Carlton 111, which says that doesn't fly. The board speaks with one voice. A director voicing a different voice is going to be in breach of his or her duty of care, and that's not appropriate. That's not right. Because condos do tend to run fast and loose, I don't like it, but that's the reality. If you ever open your bylaws, spell it out in the bylaws. Duty of confidentiality and disqualification if you breach it. It should be a no-brainer. The board speaks with whatever gets approved in the minutes. Lastly, transparency. Afterwards, minutes are a core record. All right, every owner's got the right to them, and there's nothing much you can do to stop it. And there's no cost to producing a core record, sending it out electronically. So why not just proactively don't make the owners jump through all the hoops as far as making a formal request for records? Again, that creates conflict. Why not just post them somewhere secure? Most condos have got some secure portal somewhere. Just post them. So if any owner wants to second guess what the board is doing or look into it, it's there. They're going to get it anyway. So why not just short circuit it and post them up? And I'll stop there.
Okay, I think you touched on a lot of the questions that we have in the side. So we'll go right over to Michelle now from the practical perspectives, and then we'll try and tackle a few questions before we wrap ourselves up. Over to you, Michelle.
I'll try and be, not to repeat anything Richard said, just in the effort of time, so we can maybe get to some of those extra questions. So Let me just skim my notes here. I think what I would like to do, because Richard covered some stuff that I don't need to further elaborate on. I guess I'd like to quickly touch on approval of minutes. So piggybacking on Richard's comment that it falls with the responsibility of the board. So from a management perspective, practical implementation of minutes after the meeting, always try and produce the minutes as soon as you can after the meeting takes place. The information is going to be fresh in your mind. So if you take shorthand notes, you're going to be able to elaborate on the details of that, within the couple days of the meeting, as opposed to 3 weeks after the meeting. You're not going to recall exactly what transpired. I know I got a lot going on in my mind. I'm certainly not remembering exactly what took place in a conversation 3 weeks ago. So I think within 10 business days, 2 weeks is probably the absolute outset in which you should be producing those minutes, and then provide them to the board right away. You may not have a meeting within 2 weeks, 2 weeks later, but I think just circulating to the board via email, because again, the board is also not going to remember what happened, a month before when they're sitting at the meeting about to approve those minutes. So circulate them in advance so that they can review the content while it's still fresh in their mind. But ultimately, the minutes should be approved at the next duly called board meeting, and the approval of that should be minuted in the minutes being taken for the subsequent meeting. I wholeheartedly agree with Richard with being transparent. We have much, it depends on the community, but the community and the residents are a lot happier when they feel that the board is being transparent. So whether it's a monthly highlight of the minutes or just, redacted minutes, it really helps in feeling like you are a whole community as opposed to a us versus them mentality, which sometimes arises depending on what's going on in your corporation. I want to quickly, I doctored up some bad minutes. I just want to quickly highlight some of the things that I think are bad. Please don't take offense if you do any of this. Take it away as a learning tool. So just give me 1 second here to share my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the errors or some areas that could be improved on. And you'll see that this is the same template of the good minutes you're going to get, or the template that you can use following the session. So first and foremost, we've got the condominium name, and we've said it's the minutes of the board of directors meeting. First thing I notice is that we have not noted the date that the meeting occurred or the location that it occurred. So typically you'll have a heading that will indicate when the date of the meeting was, and did it take place via Zoom, or was it held in the party room, or Tim Hortons, wherever it was held. This is all good. We've got the board members, we've got the invited guests of the meeting, we've got call to order. So the next thing I want to highlight is review of previous minutes. So the paragraph I wrote here as the minute taker in this meeting was the board reviewed the minutes of the last meeting. They advised the meeting was 2 months ago, so they couldn't recall the discussion in detail, but felt the information appeared to be correct and they had no revisions. So A, it's a little bit too detailed. B, it's unfortunate that they haven't seen or reviewed the minutes in 2 months and they can't recall the accurate discussion. So that goes to timeliness of delivery. And B, we have no recorded decision on the approval of it. So as opposed to it saying on a motion by Richard, seconded by Nancy, with the board in favor, the minutes were approved as presented. It just says the board agreed they didn't have any revisions. It's just a little less informal. Financial statements, I want to get to some of these. I'm going to quickly scroll just so you can see what these minutes look like. So we've got the items for discussion, approval, and information. So as a quick scan, you can see there are some large paragraphs here. As Richard has touched on, large paragraphs are not what we want to see. We do not want to see verbatim discussion. For example, I don't know if I can highlight this. We can also circulate this after as well, but I've basically got a transcript here. Director 1 inquired if engineering firm was qualified. Director 2 indicated that they'd worked with them in the past. Director 1 asked this question. Director 2 rebutted. Director 3 jumped in. We don't need all of that dictated to us. What we need is a summary of what we're reviewing and discussing, and then the decision and the action moving forward. So when you're producing minutes, you don't want to see large paragraphs. And then quickly, I want to highlight this quote section. So they were reviewing kitchen stack cleaning quotes. The board reviewed the quotes for the kitchen stack cleaning. The board agreed to go to contractor 1 for the cleaning. The manager will schedule the work. No discussion on how many quotes they reviewed. No noting of what the cost of that work was. And again, no recorded vote, no motion, no second in approving the work. So I just wanted to quickly highlight that in discussing kind of how to produce the minutes after the meeting. And I think that's all I want to cover here. So if there's some good questions we want to tackle in the last few minutes.
I thought
Nancy,
yeah.
can I just jump in with one other example of bad minutes?
No. Of course. Over to you.
And this is a CAT case, Barreto Rivera Metro 704. It really surprised me. 8-unit condo. They have a board policy where they will not minute expenditures under $1,000. Went to the CAT. The CAT said, yeah, well, it might not be great, but it's possible. I don't know why, it's particularly in a small condo where $1,000 is a lot of money, you would not want to adequately minute those expenditures. Doesn't make any sense to me. They're leaving the board. I don't care that it looks like this owner might be problematic because it's not his first case against that board, but they're just wide open as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting one, because I feel like if you're taking the time to discuss it during a meeting, why not throw a sentence or two in on the decision being made? That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that does go to some of the other questions we have here about the business of the meeting, business being transacted. We had a couple of questions about, well, what if a couple of people meet on the side? Does that constitute a meeting? What constitutes a meeting? Maybe when do you have to have your minutes? Maybe we'll just have a general comment on that.
Okay, meeting on the street in Tim Hortons, even Starbucks, I don't care where it is, doesn't make it a formal meeting. There's got to be proper notice of the meeting. The Act says at least 10 days. Most bylaws reduce it to 48 hours. There's got to be proper notice of that, where, when, etc. Ideally, an agenda, and there should be sufficient. If you're not getting the agenda and backup information, I think it's your duty as a director to demand it. Anything less than that, it's not a proper board meeting.
And even if someone is eventually excluded because of a conflict of interest, they still have to be invited to that meeting.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Conflict, under the Acts of Material Interest and Material Conflict, the director cannot be part of the discussion or be counted towards quorum, but they still get invited.
Right. And then another really practical question for general motions such as approval of minutes, is it necessary to reference board members who are making the motion? So for example, we did talk earlier about the particular board member's name, the mover, the seconder. Do we need to put those names in, or can we just say there was a mover, a seconder, and no objection? Thoughts on that?
Michelle, what's your thought?
My practice has always been to note the people who have moved and seconded. And then, that's all I have ever done. I've never done it differently. So that's how I tend to do it.
I'm not sure there's actually a legal requirement to do it. It's certainly the most common that I see, at least. To me, it's more if you're against it and you want to somehow, protect yourself from possible liability. If it's that extreme, identify who you are. Make sure you're identified. But as far as who actually makes the motion, votes yay, it's not really relevant.
Okay, I'm just seeing there's a couple, we're getting really short on our time here. One owner asked whether or not we can get a copy of this particular session to share with other PMs, and I'm not sure what the CCI GHC policy is on that, Richard or Michelle?
It's usually pretty quick.
Okay.
It's always recorded and then posted to the CCI Golden Horseshoe website after the fact.
Fantastic. And Rachel just chimed in and said, yes, it's recorded. So stay tuned. Watch for your postings on that. Michelle or Richard, I know that you have access to the questions. Was there anyone that I didn't get to that was burning in your soul and you wanted to answer before I do our wrap up here?
Oh, anything else from my mother, I guess.
Okay,
but
well,
no.
No?
I'm joking.
I think there's one I can answer about the items on the agenda. Any item that is not on the agenda that the board wants to include for discussion can always just be discussed under new business. So if you've asked for it to be included or it's been missed, just ask for it to be included under new business at the time of the meeting.
Yeah, okay. And I'll just add one. It is one of Patricia's, I think, which is does the board package form part of the minutes? In my view, it should not, because the board package has got a lot of information in it. Much of it could be confidential. So you've got to see what it is and what you want to read in or attach to the minutes to support whatever decision gets made.
Excellent. And I know some of the questions we received today are really great governance questions about what happens in conflictual situations, what happens as between directors, not necessarily minute specific. So they're great fodder for future condo talks. So I know that our participants today, Richard and Michelle, are going to be taking that back to the board and saying, hey, here's some great questions we had we didn't get to because they were more governance related. But stay tuned, folks. Hopefully these questions can be answered at a future date. Richard?
Yeah, one more thing. I was just reading another question. It brings up a whole different issue. The question has to do with business by email and why are property managers complicit in it. And I just want to say, property managers get bullied. And it's they get pushed, and if they don't get pushed, they're on a 90-day contract now. So, which is why they do a lot of what they do. It's because it gets demanded of them, and they voice their concern about it. And if they voice too hard, which they now have an obligation to do, which Nancy, I'm sure you do it as well. I certainly do it. You get fired, and unfortunately, getting fired does not pay the bills. So sometimes you've got to just weigh everything and hopefully back yourself. Put in place the necessary background information. I would say one more thing in support of managers. Sorry, I know I'm rambling.
Oh, it's okay.
But it struck me yesterday when I found out another firm that we work with had a COVID hit, that managers are frontline here. Like I think everybody I know firsthand with COVID is a manager. We really got to respect. They got to be given more respect than what they're being given for what they do, because it's so important, so vital for condos. I'll shut up now.
No, that's okay. I think it's a hot topic in the industry, how people are treating each other generally. Managers are bearing the brunt, board members are bearing some of the brunt, and we all need to remember to take a pause and be kind, right?
Yep.
At the end of the day, we have to be kind to each other. And that is one of the most important things in this industry. And so even if it comes down to minutes and disputes, let's take a breath, be kind, and think about how you can facilitate discussion as opposed to creating conflict. So it's clearly a super hot topic. Michelle and Richard, again, thank you so much for your time and effort put into this session today. There's a lot more to say, and I'm sure we can look forward to future events on this particular issue. Before we close off, we do have some other upcoming events for the Golden Horseshoe chapter. For example, we have Lawyers, Guns, and Money coming on January 28th. Don't miss this one. We've been doing one like that in CCIEO, and they're super hot and fun. Then we have, starting on February 1st, is your ongoing 8-part series for newer intermediate directors, the Enhanced Directors course. If you're thinking about joining a condo board or know someone who's already in a condo, the Level 100 Introduction for Condos is perfect for them. Next, we have February 9th at noon.
Nancy, just back up. That's the level. That's the advanced course, the enhanced.
Oh, sorry, I have level 100 in my notes.
We do have a level 100 coming up. I forget the exact date. The level
March
100.
4th is coming to mind.
March 4th?
Not on the screen, but March 4th is coming to mind.
And the intro course is free. Whereas the advanced course, it is 8 nights. There's fabulous materials that go with it. So there is a small cost for it.
So go to the website to make sure that you get all this information right, just in case I've made a little error in my timings or my info. These are just teasers. Richard will make sure I try and get the next teaser right. February 9th at noon, going electric? Yes, no? Maybe, Richard, you'll share a picture of your car that has been dismantled into little tiny pieces in the back and what you're going to do with that.
It's not electric.
Right. Next, of course, on March 4th, you have Introduction to Condos, and then on March 25th, you have your rapid fire legal session. A lot coming up in the next few weeks. Don't miss any of it if you can. Again, go to the website for any additional information that you might have and to register for any of those sessions. As always, your chapter welcomes any feedback that you might have. Go ahead and contact your chapter reps or any of your board members. They'll be delighted to receive your comments and your suggestions. We hope you really enjoyed today's session. And everybody looks forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Nancy, thank you.
Thank
you very much for participating, being our guest moderator. Always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was delighted. Have a great day, everybody. Take good care.